On April 26, 1986, the tranquility of the early morning was shattered by a devastating explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union. What was supposed to be a simple safety test turned into one of the worst nuclear disasters in history. A radioactive cloud spread across several countries, and the effects of the accident are still felt decades later. The Soviet government tried to cover up the severity of the situation, while thousands of people were exposed to lethal levels of radiation without even knowing the imminent danger. But what really happened that night? What secrets were hidden? And why have so many facts been distorted over the years? Hello, restless minds. I'm Code, and this is Discover It, where curiosity knows no limits. Subscribe and help the channel grow, because every time you like, comment, or share, you're helping us bring these discoveries to more people. Together, we can create a community where curiosity can change the world. And now, without further ado, let's get into the video. The Chernobyl tragedy began with an experiment that seemed harmless. The plant's operators were conducting a test to check if the turbines could generate enough electricity to keep the reactor's cooling systems running in case of a power outage. This type of test had been conducted before, but had never been successful. This time, however, the execution was riddled with human errors and rushed decisions. To carry out the experiment, the technicians drastically reduced the reactor's power, but made a critical mistake by leaving the system in a highly unstable state. Have you ever heard the phrase, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions"? Well, what was supposed to be a simple test turned into one of the greatest nuclear tragedies in history. The RBMK 1000 reactor used in Chernobyl had a severe structural flaw that was little known outside Soviet military and scientific circles. At low power levels, it became unpredictable, and any abrupt intervention could trigger an uncontrollable reaction. During the test, the operators removed control rods from the reactor core, a procedure that temporarily increased power before stabilizing it. However, the effect was the opposite of what was expected. The reactor began to increase its activity abruptly, reaching a critical point. When they realized something was wrong, the operators tried to abort the test and reinsert all the control rods to stop the nuclear reaction. The problem was that these rods had graphite tips, a material that, upon coming into contact with the overheated core, initially accelerated the reaction instead of slowing it down. Within seconds, the sudden increase in power caused an uncontrollable buildup of heat and pressure inside the reactor. At that point, there was no way to reverse the disaster. At 1:23 a.m., an initial explosion breached the reactor structure, hurling radioactive fragments into the air. Seconds later, a second, even more powerful explosion destroyed the unit's roof, exposing the plant's core directly to the atmosphere. The release of radioactive particles began immediately, contaminating not only the plant workers, but also the entire city of Pripyat and surrounding regions. If the reactor had structural flaws and the test was not safe, why was it authorized? How could human error, combined with poorly planned decisions, trigger a disaster of such catastrophic proportions? The RBMK 1000 reactor used in Chernobyl was a design developed in the Soviet Union based on Cold War nuclear technologies. Its design had a peculiar feature. It used graphite as a neutron moderator, which made it more efficient in producing plutonium, a strategic material for nuclear weapons. This factor may explain why this reactor model was widely adopted, despite its evident structural flaws. Unlike other reactors worldwide, the RBMK had a positive reactivity coefficient, meaning that under certain conditions, the nuclear reaction could intensify uncontrollably. The most dangerous flaw of this model was precisely this positive reactivity coefficient. Normally, nuclear reactors are designed to automatically reduce their power when the temperature rises, preventing instability. However, in the RBMK, reducing power under certain levels made it more unstable. This happened because the water-based cooling system also functioned as a neutron moderator. If the water evaporated or was removed, control over the nuclear reaction decreased drastically, allowing the process to accelerate dangerously. Another crucial detail lay in the control rods, which were responsible for regulating the reactor's power. In conventional reactors, these rods are made entirely of neutron-absorbing materials, such as boron. However, in the RBMK, the tips of these rods were made of graphite. This meant that when inserted into the reactor core, they first increased reactivity before reducing it. During the safety test that led to the Chernobyl explosion, this flaw proved fatal. When the operators attempted to shut down the reactor, they unknowingly accelerated the reaction even further, causing a sudden power surge and the destruction of the system. What is most alarming is that Soviet engineers had known about this problem years before the accident. Minor incidents at other plants had already indicated that the RBMK could become unstable under low-power conditions. However, this information was classified and never shared with Chernobyl's operators. They simply had no way of predicting what would happen when they started the test. If this flaw had been corrected or at least disclosed to the plant workers, could the disaster have been prevented? The Chernobyl tragedy was not just an accident, but a direct consequence of a secret kept for decades. If the RBMK's design was so flawed, why did it continue to operate? To what extent can the pursuit of energy and technological development put lives at risk? Most people believe that Chernobyl was destroyed by a single explosion, but records from the time confirm that two distinct detonations occurred. The first was a steam explosion caused by extreme pressure inside the reactor, while the second, occurring just seconds later, was even more destructive and enigmatic in nature. This second event released a massive amount of radioactive material into the air and caused catastrophic damage to the plant structure. But why did two explosions happen? And what does this reveal about the true sequence of the disaster? The first explosion occurred when the cooling water inside the reactor core came into contact with the overheated nuclear fuel. The temperature was so high that the water instantly turned into steam, generating enormous pressure within the structure. Since the pressure relief valves were closed, there was no way for this energy to escape. The result was an explosion that tore through the reactor's concrete and steel lids, launching radioactive debris into the air and opening a fissure in the plant structure. This first event was already disastrous, but what followed was even worse. The second explosion, occurring just seconds later, was chemical in nature. With the partial destruction of the reactor, large amounts of hydrogen began to accumulate inside the unit. This hydrogen was generated when water vapor reacted with the zirconium from the nuclear fuel rod claddings. When this highly flammable mixture came into contact with atmospheric oxygen, an even more powerful detonation occurred. The force of this second explosion was enough to completely destroy the reactor's lid and scatter burning graphite pieces around the plant. The impact of this second explosion was what truly sealed Chernobyl's fate. Unlike other nuclear accidents such as 3 Mile Island in the United States, where the core remained contained within the structure, at Chernobyl, the reactor core was completely exposed to the open air. This meant that radiation escaped without any kind of barrier, contaminating the atmosphere, the soil, and nearby rivers. The release of radioactive elements such as cesium-137, iodine-131, and strontium-90 had long-term consequences for human health and the environment. Chernobyl's two explosions not only turned the plant into ruins, but also demonstrated the severity of the reactor's design flaws and the way the tests were conducted. If the operators had full knowledge of the risks, could they have prevented this sequence of events? And if only the first explosion had occurred, would the disaster have been less severe, or was the destruction of the core inevitable from the start? Just minutes after the reactor explosion, firefighters from Pripyat were called in to fight the fire at the Chernobyl plant. None of them knew they were stepping into an extremely radioactive environment. Without proper protective equipment, many began to feel the effects of radiation immediately. Some reported a metallic taste in their mouths, a classic symptom of intense exposure, while others noticed their skin burning without even touching the fire. Imagine being called to put out a fire and, unknowingly, walking straight into a cloud of deadly radiation. Now that's a horror movie plot twist. But how could something invisible cause such rapid and severe damage? The radiation released by the exposed reactor core contained highly energetic particles such as gamma rays and free neutrons. These particles penetrated human tissue and caused cellular destruction on a microscopic level. At high doses, the body could not regenerate fast enough, resulting in what is known as acute radiation syndrome. The first signs included nausea, vomiting, and dizziness, but within hours, victims began developing severe skin burns, internal bleeding, and organ failure. The firefighters and plant workers closest to the explosion site received fatal doses within minutes. Among the first responders was Vasily Ignatenko, a young firefighter who, along with his team, tried to extinguish the flames on the plant's roof. They didn't know that the fire contained fragments of graphite from the reactor core, which were highly radioactive. Some firefighters reported that their uniforms began to emit a bluish glow in the dark, possibly an effect of intense ionization of the air around them. Many died days later in hospitals in Moscow, while others suffered irreversible health consequences. The radiation did not only affect those at the plant. The wind carried radioactive particles to Pripyat and other nearby cities. Many people who left their homes that morning, unaware of the accident, were exposed to alarming levels of contamination. Children played outside as radioactive dust settled on parks, streets, and buildings. The Soviet government was slow to act, and it was only 36 hours after the explosion that the city was evacuated. But by then, how many people had already been exposed to radiation without realizing it? What happened at Chernobyl revealed how devastating a nuclear disaster can be. Unlike a conventional explosion, where the damage is visible and immediate, radiation acts silently, often without the victim noticing the danger. If the residents of Pripyat had been evacuated earlier, how many lives could have been saved? In the hours following the Chernobyl explosion, highly radioactive particles began rising into the atmosphere. With no barriers to contain the contamination, elements such as iodine-131, cesium-137, and strontium-90 were released into the air and carried by the winds. The radioactive cloud was not confined to the Soviet Union. Within days, the contamination spread across several European countries, reaching as far as Sweden, Germany, France, and even the United Kingdom. How did an accident in an isolated city in Ukraine manage to affect such a significant part of the continent? The answer lies in wind dynamics and atmospheric conditions at the time. At the moment of the explosion, winds were blowing north, which caused Sweden to be the first area to detect radiation. Scientists at the Forsmark Nuclear Physics Institute noticed abnormally high radiation levels in the air and initially believed there was a leak at their own facility. After internal checks, they realized the radiation was coming from thousands of kilometers away. This is how, on April 28, 1986, 2 days after the disaster, the world learned that something catastrophic had happened in the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the radioactive cloud continued its journey. Rain carrying contaminated particles fell over forests and rivers in Belarus, one of the regions most affected by the disaster. Further south, cities in Ukraine and Russia also recorded high radiation levels. Farmers noticed their crops covered in a strange dust, while animals began falling ill without any apparent cause. The Soviet government remained silent for days, and the populations of these areas only learned the severity of the situation after they had already been exposed to radiation. Even more distant countries were not spared from the effects of contamination. In Germany, for example, health authorities detected radiation in milk and vegetables produced in rural areas. In Italy, the government temporarily banned the import of agricultural products from affected regions. In France, authorities initially denied any danger, claiming that the radioactive cloud had stopped at the border, a claim later debunked by independent measurements. The impact was so significant that decades later, some areas in Central Europe still have restrictions on consuming certain foods. Chernobyl was not just a local disaster, but a global event. The radioactive cloud demonstrated that the effects of a nuclear accident cannot be contained by political borders. If a single reactor was capable of spreading contamination across an entire continent, what would happen if a large-scale accident occurred today? Pripyat, a model city built for Chernobyl plant workers and their families, had about 50,000 residents. After the reactor explosion, the city continued operating as usual. Children went to school, workers followed their routines, and no one was informed about the invisible danger looming over the region. The Soviet government took 36 hours to order the evacuation, a delay that exposed thousands of people to alarming levels of radiation. But why was this decision delayed, even when authorities already knew the severity of the accident? Immediately after the explosion, plant technicians and firefighters attempting to contain the fire were the first to show symptoms of contamination. Many felt nausea, dizziness, and skin burns, but Pripyat's population received no immediate instructions. The next morning, a government committee was sent to the city to assess the situation. Although radiation measurement instruments already indicated extremely dangerous levels, the official decision was to keep the evacuation secret to avoid panic. Meanwhile, Pripyat's residents continued their daily activities. Children played in the streets, some even near the bridge leading to the plant, a location later known as the Bridge of Death, as those who spent too much time there received fatal radiation doses. The city was surrounded by an invisible threat, but authorities insisted that everything was under control. Even a May Day parade, scheduled for May 1st, was still part of the government's plans. Only in the afternoon of April 27th, more than a day after the explosion, did loudspeakers announce that residents had to leave their homes. The message was clear. This was a temporary evacuation, lasting only 3 days, and everyone would be able to return soon. That's why many left behind personal belongings, documents, and even pets, unaware they would never return. The buses arrived, and within hours, Pripyat was empty. What was once a vibrant city became a ghost town. However, the delayed evacuation had already sealed the fate of many. If the evacuation had occurred in the first hours of the disaster, how many lives could have been saved? Would it have been possible to minimize the health damage to thousands of people who, unknowingly, spent an entire day breathing the contaminated air of the city? Shortly after the Chernobyl accident, the Soviet government released an official death toll, 31 fatalities. This figure primarily referred to the firefighters and plant workers who died in the first few weeks due to acute radiation syndrome. However, independent studies suggest that the real impact of the catastrophe was far greater. It is estimated that tens of thousands of people died or developed severe illnesses due to radiation exposure. But why is there such a discrepancy between official numbers and the analyses conducted over the years? One of the reasons for this uncertainty is the difficulty in tracking the effects of radiation over time. Unlike a conventional disaster, where victims are immediately counted, radioactive contamination causes diseases that can take years or even decades to manifest. Thyroid cancer, leukemia, and other radiation-related illnesses became common among those who lived near the plant, but not all deaths could be directly linked to the accident. Additionally, the so-called liquidators, the workers sent to contain radiation and clean up the debris, were exposed to extremely high doses without adequate protection. It is estimated that over 600,000 people participated in containment efforts, many of whom received radiation doses far above safe limits. Many liquidators developed health problems, but their deaths were not always recorded as a direct consequence of the disaster. Reports from the World Health Organization (WHO) and the International Atomic Energy Agency (IAEA) indicate that between 4,000 and 93,000 deaths may be attributed to the accident, depending on the methodology used. Besides the direct deaths, the psychological and social impacts of the tragedy were also devastating. Thousands of people were forced to abandon their homes, and the uncertainty about radiation's effects created an environment of fear and misinformation. Chernobyl was not just an environmental and nuclear tragedy, it was also a human catastrophe whose consequences are still debated. If the true number of victims will never be precisely known, to what extent do the official statistics reflect reality? How many lives were silently lost due to a disaster that could have been prevented? Shortly after the Chernobyl accident, the Soviet government released an official death toll: 31 fatalities. This figure primarily referred to the firefighters and plant workers who died in the first few weeks due to acute radiation syndrome. However, independent studies suggest that the real impact of the catastrophe was far greater. It is estimated that tens of thousands of people died or developed severe illnesses due to radiation exposure. But why is there such a discrepancy between official numbers and the analyses conducted over the years? One of the reasons for this uncertainty is the difficulty in tracking the effects of radiation over time. Unlike a conventional disaster, where victims are immediately counted, radioactive contamination causes diseases that can take years or even decades to manifest. Thyroid cancer, leukemia, and other radiation-related illnesses became common among those who lived near the plant, but not all deaths could be directly linked to the accident. Additionally, the so-called liquidators, the workers sent to contain radiation and clean up the debris, were exposed to extremely high doses without adequate protection. It is estimated that over 600,000 people participated in containment efforts, many of whom received radiation doses far above safe limits. Many liquidators developed health problems, but their deaths were not always recorded as a direct consequence of the disaster. Reports from the World Health Organization (WHO) and the International Atomic Energy Agency (IAEA) indicate that between 4,000 and 93,000 deaths may be attributed to the accident, depending on the methodology used. Besides the direct deaths, the psychological and social impacts of the tragedy were also devastating. Thousands of people were forced to abandon their homes, and the uncertainty about radiation's effects created an environment of fear and misinformation. Chernobyl was not just an environmental and nuclear tragedy, it was also a human catastrophe whose consequences are still debated. If the true number of victims will never be precisely known, to what extent do the official statistics reflect reality? How many lives were silently lost due to a disaster that could have been prevented? After the explosion of Reactor 4, the biggest challenge for Soviet authorities was containing the radiation that was still leaking uncontrollably. Since the reactor core was completely exposed, tons of radioactive materials were being released into the atmosphere every day. The emergency solution was the construction of a sarcophagus of concrete and steel around the destroyed reactor, a hastily built structure with severe limitations. Over the years, this shield began to deteriorate, creating a new risk. What if it collapsed and released even more radiation? The original sarcophagus was completed in November 1986, just 7 months after the accident. It was designed to isolate the destroyed core from the atmosphere, but it was never meant to be a permanent solution. Over time, cracks began to appear in the structure, allowing rainwater to seep in, increasing the risk of corrosion and new chemical reactions within the debris. Scientists warned that if the sarcophagus collapsed, tons of radioactive dust could be released into the air, triggering a secondary disaster. In 1997, it was decided that a new containment structure was necessary. Thus, planning began for the new safe confinement. A colossal steel structure designed to completely cover the old sarcophagus and prevent radioactive leaks for at least 100 years. The construction of this new barrier took more than a decade and became one of the most ambitious engineering projects in the world. In 2016, the structure was finally completed and positioned over the reactor, ensuring a new level of safety for the area. Even with this new containment, Chernobyl still poses a challenge. Inside the destroyed reactor, there is a mass of molten material known as the elephant's foot, a highly radioactive formation of nuclear fuel and fused concrete. This substance continues to emit intense radiation, making any attempt at removal extremely dangerous. Additionally, some scientists fear that nuclear reactions may still be occurring slowly within the debris, though at controlled levels. Chernobyl is not just a past accident. It is an issue that still requires constant monitoring. If the original sarcophagus became unstable within a few decades, will the new containment truly last an entire century? And if new failures are discovered, what will be the next steps to ensure that Chernobyl does not once again threaten the world? After the mass evacuation of Pripyat, the city was completely abandoned, turning into a place frozen in time. Buildings, schools, hospitals, and even an amusement park remained untouched, with personal belongings left behind as if the residents were expected to return at any moment. But despite the official absence of inhabitants, Pripyat was never completely deserted. Over the years, scientists, adventurers, and even former residents have returned to the city, turning it into a place where life still insists on existing, even in the face of radiation. In the decades following the disaster, a peculiar group of people defied the exclusion zone and returned to their former homes. Known as Samosli, meaning self-settlers in Russian, these residents, mostly elderly, decided they preferred to live in their homeland despite the risks. Many of these returnees lived there for years without showing severe symptoms of contamination, sparking debate among scientists about how the human body might adapt to prolonged exposure to moderate levels of radiation. Besides the Samosli, Chernobyl attracted another type of visitor: scientists and researchers from various fields. The exclusion zone became a massive natural laboratory where experts analyzed the effects of radiation on the environment. The most surprising discovery was the resurgence of wildlife, with wolves, lynxes, bears, and other species thriving in the absence of humans. Without hunters or deforestation, the region became a sanctuary for animals, leading some specialists to question whether, paradoxically, the absence of humans has been more beneficial to nature than radiation has been harmful. In recent decades, Pripyat has also become a destination for adventurers and tourists seeking a unique experience. Despite the risks, guided tours have been organized, allowing visitors to explore abandoned buildings and witness the remnants of everyday life left behind. Hospitals with stretchers still prepared for patients who never arrived, children's toys scattered on the floors of daycare centers, and apartments with dining tables still set for meals reveal the brutality of a sudden evacuation. Pripyat is a city that should have been forgotten, yet it continues to fascinate and intrigue. While concrete structures slowly deteriorate, life, both human and wild, finds ways to persist. But for how long? Could Pripyat ever be safely reoccupied, or will it forever remain a silent reminder of the greatest nuclear tragedy in history? Chernobyl was not just an accident. It was an event that exposed human fragilities, technological failures, and the hidden dangers of nuclear energy when handled without transparency and responsibility. Decades later, the consequences are still visible. Whether in the devastated landscape of the exclusion zone, in the records of victims whose exact number may never be known, or in the bitter lessons that have shaped global nuclear safety. Even after so much time, the question remains: could this tragedy have been avoided if warnings had been heeded in time? The legacy of Chernobyl endures, not only as a grim reminder of past mistakes, but as a warning for the future. While the ghost town of Pripyat withstands the test of time and nature reclaims its space, humanity continues to study and monitor what remains of that fateful day in 1986. But perhaps the greatest question is not what happened in Chernobyl, but rather, have we learned enough to ensure that something like this never happens again? If you enjoyed this journey of discoveries, don't forget to leave a like, share it with your friends, and comment below on what caught your attention the most. Maybe others can relate, and we can create a great discussion. And of course, subscribe to the channel for more content where curiosity knows no limits.